One of the many crises or problems that result from trauma in a traumatically illiterate culture is not knowing how to behave. And if you think of identity as a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, then trauma is the process of shattering the pattern. When a pinball and a bowling ball collide, moving in opposite directions, the pinball goes flying. The bowling ball continues on its original trajectory. And this is the phenomena of trauma for the I, the ego, that identifies with the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that was the pinball, the identity that went cascading off in a different direction, the identity that was shattered, that was threatened in some way. And the pattern is threatened by a force, by another pattern of energy that is bigger, more forceful than it. So it's the law of mass. When two masses collide, the bigger mass dictates the trajectory of the smaller mass, creating trauma for the smaller pattern of energy. Now, that trauma creates dissociation, creates chaos, creates uncertainty. The pattern has not been established. It's hard to find a new stable pattern to identify with when flying through the air at 30 miles an hour randomly after colliding with a larger object. And so there's this chaotic disorientation, and there's a looking for some pattern to hold on to. Because the ego is that which identifies with a pattern, a self-referential pattern, a pattern that has repeated many times in the past. When I look forward and look into the mirror, I see shapes, patterns that are familiar, remind us of family. I see past patterns, and I reassemble the past pattern, and I say, that's me. I identify with that pattern of color, that pattern of shape, that pattern of sound, that pattern of eating, that pattern of spending money, that pattern of having sex, that pattern of speech, that pattern of tonal range. All the identity is a recognizable pattern of energy that we say, oh, I know who that is, that's me. Because the patterns going on right now have occurred many times in the past. But when the pattern shatters in a traumatic event, we can no longer recognize ourselves because who we were was sent flying by a larger mass, by another pattern. So we cannot recognize ourselves. And we say things like, this isn't me. Meaning, I am now in a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that I've never seen before. Now, this is particularly and in and of itself traumatizing for people with PTSD, because people with post-traumatic stress disorder have experienced repeated trauma before that they have not been able to successfully resolve, transcend, and heal from. So when you've experienced a pattern of traumatic violation, of traumatic relationship with other patterns before, number one, that by definition, if you're still exhibiting the symptoms of PTSD, you don't know how to respond to, you can't resolve. Then one looks out at the world as a frightening place, as a place that periodically produces large masses of energy that crash overwhelmingly down upon us and send us in an unpredictable direction from which we cannot find ourselves again, from which we cannot recover the old pattern. We're now in the pattern of the disorder, and that in of itself becomes an identity. One way to look at PTSD is that as that pinball is going flying through the air in an unpredictable state of shock after the collision with the bowling ball, the pinball is looking frantically for a new pattern, something to hold on to, that the ego, the I, can identify with, can attach to, some pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And the last and most intense pattern for that ego in that dissociative, traumatized state was the traumatic event itself. That's clear, it's crisp. And so in the loss of identity that we identify with, in the loss of that pattern, we hold on to the traumatic event itself and repeat it as a way of feeling like we've got something solid. And in many ways it makes sense because the trauma, having disrupted the old pattern, is presenting itself as a very intense thing to disrupt, meaning trauma produces very vivid, timeless memories. So an easy thing to hold on to, I can relive the memory again and again, and I can identify with that memory. I am now the person who had that trauma, and I relive that as something to hold on to. And the question is, what else in the world is going to be solid and reliable enough to migrate from, right? If we're not holding on to that, what would be solid enough to hold on to other than that? And in many cases, the trauma survivor doesn't know because they didn't see the trauma coming in many cases, or they didn't expect that to send them flying. And in a cult that is psychologically illiterate, we can go cradle to grave without a single hour of scientific exploration of what identity is that we can identify with. We don't know. We don't ask. Nobody tells. It's a don't ask, don't tell cult of sustained ignorance. So we need an identity. We need a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, because otherwise we're overwhelmed. If there's no pattern, we're just beset with a billion different choices, how to breathe, how to respond, what language to speak, what to do this. We need patterns that we can rely on, patterns that produce generally good results. Now, how do you form a pattern in the unknown? It's a good question. Nobody's ever explained that to me. How do you form an identity in unknown territory? And that's one of the crimes, one of the traumas that a perpetrator transfers to their victim in a traumatically illiterate culture. So let me explain. My therapist, Peter Sandhill, sexually abused me in a psychedelic therapeutic session. I had never been drunk in my life. I'd never been high. I'd never taken a psychedelic. And so the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that shifts in the psychedelic state, I did not know how to relate to that new identity. So I identified with it. But then I also didn't know how to relate to homosexuality. So I didn't know what form of identity to form around that. And then nobody had ever said, this is how you're supposed to respond. This is how you're supposed to think, feel, speak, do, and be when your therapist shows sexual interest in you. There were so many things happening at once in a dissociative state that I didn't know how to respond. Now, that brings us to the present time. There's no books that I've come across how to respond to a sexually abusive therapist. No movies about the topic, as far as I can tell. I found one, Holy Hell, probably more than a year after the event. But the big question is, who am I around this? What do I think? Was it being generous? It's like free sex, right? A bonus thrown in on top of the therapeutic contract. Is that how to look at it? Is it cruelty? Is it stupidity? Like, what's going on over there? And you see, in most cases, people do not teach a therapist what a healthy identity is around their sexual interest with a patient either. They're just very clear therapeutic guidelines not to do it. Now, this bewilderment about so many things going on at the same time that I didn't know how to respond to, that I had no pre-established any pattern around, was in and of itself a crisis. I meet this person, should I be enraged? You fucking, bastard, you broke the law, you violated every therapeutic guideline in the book, you threw me under the bus, you did this, you did this. Should I be pitying, like you poor person, you don't even know how to do your job? Should I be protective? Because identity is one of the most fragile things that we have. I mean, if you lose your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, you lose the pattern. And you don't know where you are. And so you lose your identity, you lose yourself. That's a pretty big deal. And so if you take someone into terrain in which they have no pattern and no basis for establishing a pattern, surrounded by people who have no pattern and no intelligence, because if you look at the intelligence continuum, every identity has a probability field in a given environment. So one of the reasons that it's such a big deal for therapists to not molest their patients in a therapeutic container is, first of all, it throws the client into secrecy, right? Because as soon as the therapist does establish a romantic relationship with a client, they are now in a position where they could be fired or arrested. So the therapist, out of self-preservation of their identity, their pattern of being a therapist, now has to coerce the patient into secrecy and silence, when in general, the whole focus and health of therapists is to take silent secrets out into a healthy and trustworthy environment. So if a lot of the therapy, a lot of the efficacy and effectiveness of therapy is to take secret shames and take them out and to give them some air and look at them objectively with another compassionate human being, to flip that role, to ask the therapeutic client to pay money to hold the shame and secrecy of the therapist, is saying, I'm going to pay you to make my life worse. Well, that's a betrayal of trust. See, but these things have to be worked out. They're not clear, particularly when the new identity induced in a psychedelic state is not clear, because it's an unfamiliar pattern, meaning in this case, is psilocybin shuts blood down to the default mode network of the brain, which means that your normal patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being get less blood, and there's room for new patterns to grow. But by the same token, the new patterns that are growing, regardless of their health and, or benefits, are fragile. They're like new seedlings poking up through, like an oak tree seedling that's 2 inches tall. Maybe in 30 years, if you continue to water this oak tree, it'll be really, really tough. But as it's just budding out of the acorn, a single bite by a squirrel and it's done, right? And so there's this new identity. And there's fragility around that. And there's fear and uncertainty because it's unknown. Where is it coming from? Is it going to make things better? Is it going to make things worse? Because every change in identity either makes things better overall or makes things worse. Like if you have a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that keeps you on the sidewalk on a busy street, and you change the pattern, you decide that it'd be better to be spontaneous and dance in the road. And statistically speaking, people who are spontaneous and dance in the road on busy streets are 99% more likely to get into a serious traumatic accident than the people that maintain the old identity and stay on the sidewalk. Well, then your new identity, let's give it a try, becomes a traumatic event, becomes dangerous. And see, whenever you form a new identity, the very nature of it is you don't know where it's going to go. It takes time to develop a statistical probability field for that new identity. And it's incredibly vulnerable. Because if at that new seedling state you start to attach and identify with that new pattern, and that's right when the squirrel comes and eats the seedling, well, it's a traumatic event. And it discourages, I don't want to go back to new. I just want to go back to the way things were before, and I'm not budging. I'm not going out into the unknown again because it's too chaotic. It's too frightening. You see, and we don't know how the neighborhood responds to hearing that we've been raped. We've never done it before. And you see, the neighborhood doesn't know. And friends don't know, because that's the nature of a traumatically illiterate culture. A traumatically literate culture, a psychologically literate culture, explores the relative pros and cons and probability fields associated with different identities and develops a technique of analysis where you could say, well, if I change this pattern of thinking and feeling, speaking, doing, and being. It seems pretty harmless. If I change this, the worst case scenario could be that this happens. And if I look at statistics, it can tell me that if I do this, this happens. See, I didn't know it at the time, but 99% of the time, when a therapist initiates a romantic relationship with a patient in a paid container, the patient loses. Meaning 95% of the time or more, the patient's life goes downhill as a direct corollary with entering a romantic relationship with their therapist. And they lose their therapist, and they lose trust in therapists, and their therapist loses a detached interest in their well-being and becomes more and more controlling and needing to manipulate the patient to do things that are good for them rather than what's good for the patient. That's a lot of things going wrong. And then most of the rest of the cult in the culture doesn't have any idea of how this can happen, or goes into various simplistic coping mechanisms to say, well, you shouldn't have done that, and I'm busy, right? Now that can destroy relationships. So in a statistical probability field where 95% plus a percentage of the time, the client's life deteriorates as a result of a romantic engagement with a therapist, it becomes hostile or cruel for, a mildly educated therapist to create or allow the patient to enter that probability field where there's a 95% chance of things going wrong. But it's a mixed bag. Because, of course, there's some part that wants more attention, that wants more value, that wants someone to be interested, particularly in a landscape of isolation and loneliness. So it's confusing. And, for years now, I don't know how to sort through all of the different layers of probable reaction to running into my abuser in Safeway, to running into the colleagues who defended and recommended what turned out to be an unlicensed therapist. Right? Because a certain amount of it depends on the story. But what I find to be most helpful is to look at the probability field. If 95% of the time when I give you a tablespoon of arsenic, you get sick, it's unethical, it's unkind, it's unprofessional for me as a doctor to hand you a tablespoon of arsenic. It's that simple. If 95% of the time, when you coerce a client into secrecy and silence, it's bad for the patient, but protects the therapist's career. It's unethical for a therapist to take money, promising the best interest for the patient, and then to coerce the patient from that authority role into silence and secrecy. So you look at the statistics, basically. You take 100 people and say, how many times out of 100 when a therapist manipulates a client to be silent and secret, does the client come out knowing more about healthy relationships with themselves and others? If the answer is 0, then any competent friend or human being or professional doesn't exploit the vulnerability and trust of a client in a psychologically illiterate culture to send them down that road. And so then you have to learn a bunch of statistics that nobody teaches. Do you know how many therapists have had a sexual relationship with at least one client? They don't like talking about this. So that becomes a more difficult thing. How do you gather the statistics to base decisions on when the people that know that information the most, in this case the therapist, do not want to tell you the information? Because that would be in your interest as the client or as the public, but not in their interest, since it is against the law. And so we're really in quite a big tangle, but the main point that I wanted to make in this video is that when we traumatize someone in a traumatically illiterate culture, when we abuse someone in a psychologically illiterate culture that cross-wires love and abuse, when we sexually abuse a client as a therapist, we are throwing them into a probability field that is hostile towards their well-being, that they have not been educated around, and that no one around them has been educated around, which means when you have severe ignorance on all sides, that at the very time when you're in the most pain, confusion, and terror, nobody around you knows what they're doing, which escalates the pain, loneliness, and terror, and distrust in the cult that is capable of producing this phenomena, but is not capable of responding. And that is the hostility that we give to a child who is molested by a parent, to a victim who is chronically bullied and shamed for not sticking up for themselves. We are throwing portions of the population into a soup that nobody knows how to get them out of, that is highly toxic for their well-being, if for no other reason than that so much is going on and we have no idea what we're doing. We just realize that we're playing with the raw code of identity, which is the most precious recipe that a human being can have. Who you are is a script, is a series of patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Every time you change that script, your well-being goes up statistically or down statistically in a given environment. Every time you traumatically change that script, you're at risk of losing who you are, of going insane, of no longer being able to coordinate and integrate thoughts and feelings, and behavior, past behavior and present behavior. And the unknown is 99.9% bigger than the known. When you throw someone out into the abyss, there's no saying if they will come out of it and how they will get out of it. Some will cling to the traumatic event for the rest of their life as a defining identity. Others will become phobic and become more and more frightened of reality that reminds them of the traumatic incident. Others will refuse to talk about it because it brings up the overwhelm of I don't know what to say, and you don't know how to respond. And 90% of the people in our cult haven't a clue how to respond to sexual abuse for a child, in a married relationship, or with a therapist. You see, and the abuser and the victim doesn't know either.